Today, we have the pleasure of highlighting a wonderful organization, the Nature Conservancy. And sometimes when you turn on the news and you see all these documentaries, you can't help but feel really, really sad about what's going on. That's why we need to highlight those folks who are doing the work, who are doing all the great things that need to happen so that our planet stays healthy and that we can continue to provide for generations to come. So again, you hear me time and time again, thank the Key Biscayne Community Foundation for this incredible program. We hope that we can continue our partnership, and this has become one of the best lunches we offer.
My name is Ramya. I'm the Director of Environmental Science at the Key Biscayne Community Foundation. Today we have with us Chris Bergh from the Nature Conservancy. On a side note, the Nature Conservancy has a very soft spot in my heart because I worked for them for a little while as a contractor on a really interesting project in Grenada, where they were building a pilot project for an artificial reef to rebuild an area where the reef had degraded. And it had some really good and really interesting results. Let me introduce Chris and let him take over.
Well, thank you very much, Ramya. Thank you from the Nature Conservancy to the Community Foundation, and thank you so much, all of you, for coming out. What we're going to do is get warmed up with a short video to talk a bit about who the Nature Conservancy is. Then I'll introduce you to our sort of global work, our Florida focal areas, and then the bulk of the talk is going to be particularly about our marine conservation work that takes place in and around your neighborhood. So let's go with the video, please.
Our world. Let us be the stewards of nature's gems. Together, we'll make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for the planet and generations to come.
Thank you. You'll notice a mix there, an emphasis on Florida, but we are a global organization. The title of the talk today is Together We Find a Way, because not just the Nature Conservancy, not just our staff, but our donors, our members, people that have an interest in the kinds of work that we do are all in this together, working towards biodiversity conservation, the diversity of plants and animals and natural communities that represent the diversity of life, not just in Florida, not just in the US, but all across the globe. You know, we can't do it without you. So I am Chris Bergh. I'm the Field Program Director. I happen to be based in the Florida Keys, where for many years I was the Florida Keys Program Director, but you know, we reorganize periodically, trying to be good stewards of the donations and public grants that we get to make the best impact that we can. Field program means when we go out and help state parks, national wildlife refuges, private landowners, whoever we're going out to help, as opposed to the lands that we manage within our network of nature preserves. That's the field program. That's under my purview. So I have projects including coral reef conservation here in South Florida, longleaf pine restoration, reforestation in North Florida, prescribed burning in Central Florida, in which we're helping our public agency and private partners with their lands and their waters. So our mission is to preserve or conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. Now, different organizations define their missions differently. They would define what this means various ways. For us, this means wildlife, it means plants, it also means people. So we're very interested in the ways that people are interdependent upon or dependent upon nature. The better that people understand their dependence upon nature, the better stewards they are likely to be, and we really focus on that. We're a global conservation organization, one of the largest. We have about 900 scientists on staff. We've got about 5,000 staff in all. We've got more than 1 million members all across the globe. I've met a few members here already. Any members in the room? Thank you very much. And over the years, since 1951, when we got started, we've protected at this point, more than 125 million acres of terrestrial conservation areas and more than 280 million acres of ocean area. Now that doesn't mean people can never go there. Often these are places that are actively used by people for recreation, sometimes for compatible uses like sustainable forestry or sustainable grazing and so on. but they are places that will not be developed into future cities and things like that. Everything we do focuses on biodiversity, the diversity of life on Earth, and climate change right now. Climate is the crisis of the moment. People can and do argue about what's causing it. The fact is that climate is changing. People are contributing to that change, and we need to both deal with the root causes of the problem as well as adapt. As residents of Key Biscayne, you're no doubt aware of the impacts of several manifestations of climate change: rising sea levels, hotter temperatures. We just went through, at least in the Florida Keys, the hottest May ever. Coral bleaching, I'll tell you more about that. All sorts of things that are really relevant to this part of the world. So this photo is from Biloxi, Mississippi, where the Gulf Corps members, which is a Nature Conservancy program up in the northern Gulf, are building oyster reefs, trying to bring the oysters back. If you can bring the oysters back and they form oyster reefs, those reefs become habitat for other fish, crabs, and other invertebrates, the diversity of life. But these oyster reefs also protect the shoreline from erosion, from waves, from flooding, from things that cause harm to people and property. We're dealing with these two interconnected crises: biodiversity loss and climate change. These are how we classify our big priorities: tackling climate change, as I just said, providing food and water sustainably. So we all need to eat. We're about to enjoy some lovely food, I'm sure. We all need fresh water, but we can do that sustainably or we can do that unsustainably. And we have identified, our scientists have identified, that one of the most crucial things that we can do is help food producers, farmers, fishermen, etc., provide food that we need sustainably instead of unsustainably. And finally, the sort of broad category: protect the ocean, the land, and fresh water for all of the species and all of the human uses associated with it. This is our list of what we call our 2030 goals. This is what we are driving at. Reducing climate impacts to maintain a livable world. Our piece of that puzzle, and we can't do it alone, is trying to reduce on an annual basis 3 billion metric tons of carbon that otherwise would be going into the atmosphere. On the resilient ecosystems and flourishing communities front, we're trying to help 100 million people that are already at risk of flooding or wildfires or droughts or other climate-associated challenges. Sustainable solutions for thriving oceans. That'll kind of be getting into a lot of my talk later. We're focused on 4 billion hectares, that's about 10 billion acres of ocean protection. Healthy lands for a healthier planet, 650 million hectares, about 15 million acres of protection of forests, grasslands, and other terrestrial communities. And then restored rivers, lakes, and wetlands, shooting for 1 million kilometers of rivers conserved and 30 million hectares, that's about 70 million acres of lakes and wetlands conserved. And finally, thriving communities stewarding global ecosystems. We've found throughout our work since the 50s that we can buy land and protect it and create nature preserves, but if the surrounding community isn't part of the process, if they are starving or if they are not able to meet the needs of the next generations in that part of the world, the likelihood that our protected area is going to continue to be healthy and not become a site for poaching or incompatible land uses that are creeping in from the edges goes way down. So by working with communities, particularly indigenous and local communities, we found that that's the way to get durable conservation beyond the land acquisition. We're going to have these neighbors wherever we buy that land, or whoever ends up owning that land is going to have these neighbors into perpetuity. They need to be part of the picture. Bringing it down now into Florida, before I get really specific about the local marine work. We have a strategic plan, as all good organizations do. We have 5 strategies, the 4 around the outside and the yellow one in the middle. The brown pie wedge there, building a sustainable Florida, is really focused on cities. Cities are where most of us live. Cities are where a lot of our commerce takes place. Cities are the places that use a lot of the natural resources, be they food or water or sustainably generated power, or you name it. So focusing on conservation in cities is part of our focus. Transforming marine management is really fundamentally mostly about fishery management in our case. So we're working on oyster restoration, we're working on sustainable snapper grouper fisheries, and so on. Inspiring climate action, part of that outcome is 3 billion metric tons per year we're trying to take out of the atmosphere by planting more trees, or keep from getting into the atmosphere by putting more solar panels, wind turbines, whatever the appropriate alternative energy source is as an alternative to fossil fuels. And then the blue, this is where I do most of my work, conserving resilient lands, oceans, and waters. This is about buying conservation land. This is about conserving or securing conservation easements so that important natural areas don't become developed. This is about working with the people that manage the marine and freshwater spaces to conserve them, not just to protect them in a legal sense, but to make sure that they're adequately managed. And then in the middle, the yellow, which sort of ties all these together, is what we call our Center for Conservation Initiatives. And it is a new way of looking at our existing nature preserves. We've got nature preserves all over the state, but these are the ones that are big enough to have offices and staff. So Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve, the Disney Wilderness Preserve just south of Orlando, Tiger Creek Preserve near Lake Wales, and Blowing Rocks Preserve at the south end of Jupiter Island, just north of Palm Beach County, are our major campus nature preserves, we call them. And instead of each one being its own little island of activity, we coordinate their effort together. All 4 of them are supervised by my colleague, a co-worker, and they're all pulling in the same direction, trying to do 4 major things. One is improve natural resource stewardship. So often pine forest, that means prescribed fire, invasive species control, wetlands restoration, whatever the needs of that area may be. They're working on stewardship. They're working on science. Usually, if it's science that we're footing the bill for, we're trying to figure out how can we do stewardship better, how can we make conservation more durable, that sort of thing. But we welcome others from universities that may want to study things that are relatively obscure. We welcome that. The more science, you never know where the science is going to lead you. So we support that. We do a lot of training and education. So we have a hard time getting people to want to do some of these natural resource management jobs, like be prescribed burners or invasive species control technicians. It's hot, it's hard, it's dirty, doesn't pay very well, I'm afraid. But we need those people, and we need them to have a certain skill set so that we can hire them for our own nature preserves, natural areas like state parks, wildlife refuges, and so on. Have the future people who are going to do that work, and eventually, a certain subset of them become managers like myself, and they move up and they train the next generation. So we're very focused on training the next generation, and then finally doing outreach, getting the youth involved, getting them to come out, get exposed to nature if they're city people, get opportunities for internships, all sorts of engagement opportunities. So that's the Center for Conservation Initiatives. I'll just touch on these other Florida strategies. This is the Building a Sustainable Florida initiative focused on Central Florida, although we have had off and on activity here in Miami-Dade County. Things like green printing. You know what blueprinting is. You plan things out before you spend the money to build things. Green printing is the same. Figuring out where you can make the most effective investments in things like, we call it tree resilience, but urban tree planting efforts that are going to create more shade, absorb more stormwater, do all the good things that trees do, including, of course, be great habitat for butterflies, birds, squirrels, whatever lives in that area. And then irrigation-free pilot area. We've got a lot of water in Florida compared to a lot of places, but we cannot waste it. It's vital. If we waste it on things like irrigation, and not all irrigation is wasted by any means, but if we waste it, we don't have it for the natural environment, we don't have it for our own consumption, industrial uses, and all the various other needs. Inspiring climate action is really focused on 3 different things. Climate adaptation, that is helping people cope with the effects of climate change, like sea level rise, like droughts, floods, etc. Climate mitigation, that's planting pine trees, that's planting mangroves, that is restoring all sorts of vegetation to places where it has been lost or degraded in order to absorb more carbon dioxide, sequester it into the tissues of those plants, get it down into the roots and into the soil where it will stay put and not be up in the atmosphere causing global warming. And then renewable energy. So, we've been burning fossil fuels hand over fist for the last couple of 100 years. We are seeing the consequences of it. They are finite in any event. We won't have fossil fuels forever. So by weaning off of those and getting into things like solar, which really makes a lot of sense for Florida, and in some places wind, which is not as good a fit for Florida, and in other places it's tidal power, or you name it. Renewable sources of energy are the major solution, along with sequestering the carbon. Transforming marine management. I mentioned oyster reefs a few times. So we've got coral reefs out here. They are full of biological diversity, fish, crabs, invertebrates of all kinds. In the temperate areas further north from here, where instead of mangroves and corals, you've got marshes and oyster reefs, they serve the same function. There's just really one kind of oyster, but they create these incredibly large reef structures that provide the habitat for fish like redfish, sea trout, sheep's head, you name it. All sorts of northern fish, northern Florida fish, but also blue crabs, things that are commercially important, they're recreationally important, and all the other micro little things that live in among the oysters that are part of the food web. And then sustainable fisheries, we distinguish, there are oyster fisheries, but really in sustainable fisheries we're focused on fin fish, that is things like snappers and groupers. You've got mahi-mahi or dorado, dolphin, whatever you like to call it in that photo. Our fisheries effort is getting people to understand how to handle fish that they catch so that if they're too small, they get released and they survive that handling, and how to provide the right kind of data through the right kind of digital apps so that the managers, the state and the federal fishery managers, know how much is being caught, how much is being released, how much is being lost in the process, how much is being harvested, so that they can turn the dials on the fishery management regulations and people can keep catching and successfully enjoy, whether it's a commercial harvest or a recreational harvest, long into the future. And then the Oceans and Coast Network encompasses fisheries, it encompasses restoration and all the other ocean uses. Transportation, there are shipping lanes out there. There are renewable energy, proposals. People want to put wind turbines all over the ocean. The question is, where are the really important places for biodiversity that should not have that kind of activity? And how can we steer the development of compatible ocean uses, things that we need or may need, to the right places while still conserving biodiversity. And the Oceans and Coast Network is our way of looking across the whole southeastern Gulf to accomplish that. Promise we're getting local almost. This is the final Florida-wide strategy, conserving resilient lands, oceans, and waters. For many, many years, since 1951, when the Nature Conservancy started, we were known as a land buying organization. People would give us money, we would buy land, we would make nature preserves, we would give the land that we had purchased to states, federal governments for parks and refuges and things like that. And we still do a lot of that, including, in particular, focused on the longleaf pine forest region of the Panhandle, kind of from Tallahassee over to the Caloosahatchee River, and then closer to home here, the headwaters of the Everglades. Everglades restoration is important in many, many, many ways, but making sure that there's not incompatible development happening in that relatively rural area north of Lake Okeechobee is one big focus for us. That's the headwaters of the Everglades, or South Central Florida. And then in Southwest Florida, the focus is on creating or maintaining a corridor for the Florida panther, which needs a lot of land to be able to have its young and spread out and allow its very small population to grow. And then the Red Star down here, if you drive to the Florida Keys, you drive past an area called the Model Lands, M-O-D-E-L, Model Land Company. They subdivided that, they were selling it. It's not a great place to develop because it's super wet. It's essentially the connection between Biscayne Bay and Biscayne National Park and Everglades National Park. And we, the Nature Conservancy, have a long-running partnership with Miami-Dade County to serve as the land acquisition agent for the county in the model lands. So we make offers, sometimes, we make 10 offers and finally somebody says, okay, we'll sell. We, develop the deal and then the county closes the deal. The county owns the land, the county manages the land. We use our land acquisition expertise to make the deals happen. As of now, that effort has produced about 25,000 acres of protected land that will not be urbanized, developed. It will remain in a natural state. Now, moving into the marine stuff. So this is another map of protection, things that we protected through land acquisition. The little dots are places all through the Florida Keys that we helped to buy. The closest one being number 1 up there, that's some of the land in Biscayne National Park, all the way down to number 16, that's in Key West. But the real focus is the dark blue outline on the map. That's the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, which stops right out here, just outside Biscayne National Park. Biscayne goes out to, I believe, 60 feet, and the sanctuary goes from 60 feet out to the edge of federal waters. And that's that long tail that you see up there. So creating the marine sanctuary, you can't buy the ocean. We can't get donations and buy the ocean, but we can advocate for conservation of the ocean, and in this case, the establishment of a marine sanctuary, which still allows, I grew up in Key West, fishing, diving, boating, all the good stuff. I still do all those things all throughout the Florida Keys, but the sanctuary's establishment meant no oil drilling, no wastewater, no water pollution, direct discharges of pollution, no dredging, a variety of sort of blanket regulations like that. And over time, they created some sort of small scale areas where you can only dive and not fish, or where you can only do research and not do any of the other activities. Very tiny areas. So that's the sanctuary. Why did we get involved with marine conservation, and why in South Florida? A big part of the answer, and it's not all about coral reefs. When I talk about coral reefs, the coral reefs are interconnected to the seagrass meadows, interconnected to the mangroves, interconnected with all of the water and the places that the water comes from, which means the mainland or the shore. But let's say, we talk about Southwest Florida and we talk about panthers. When we talk about marine conservation in South Florida, you're going to hear me talk about coral reefs, because they are, in essence, the poster child. Values, the blue numbers, blue and black, that's sort of global, and the red are Florida specific. So medicine, so a lot of bioprospecting, a lot of pharmaceutical prospecting occurs on coral reefs because they are full of chemical compounds that haven't been discovered yet or studied yet. About half of all new drugs, drug research focuses on marine compounds, and coral reefs are full of them. Biodiversity, only 1% of the ocean floor is covered by coral reefs, but about 25% of all the marine life, marine fish, are found associated with those reefs. The structure that the reefs create is habitat for those fish. Coastal protection, and here we get quite more specific. So generally speaking, a big healthy coral reef knocks down 97% of the wave energy from incoming waves. Here in Florida, that translates to $675 million worth of coastal protection. Imagine if we had to go out and build something that did what the coral reef does. Not that we want to do that, but that would be the value of it. $675 million every year in coastal protection, just in Florida alone. And then tourism, 70 million dive trips and other reef-related trips around the world every year. And 30 million of that 70 million is right here in Florida. 30 million out of the global 70 million is right here in Florida. $6 billion worth of economic activity every year. And then finally, food production. I actually think this number is a little low. $166 million worth of fish, lobster, stone crab, marine fisheries every year. So they're super valuable, and that's why we wanted to focus on them. So what do you need to do when you want to conserve the reefs? We started our reef and marine program in South Florida in the late 1980s with an emphasis on the Florida Keys that has since expanded. And part of that was we didn't even really know at the time that there were coral reefs all the way up the East Coast as far as St. Lucie Inlet. We were focused on the Keys because that's where we thought the reefs were. So getting good data, where are they? What kind of condition are they in was the first step. And the pink or coral color here is where the reefs are located in Florida. And then the condition, how are they doing is a whole nother matter. We really need to understand that in order to understand what's driving the difference between healthy looking coral reefs here in the bottom and relatively unhealthy looking coral reefs in the top photo. So what are the threats? I mentioned climate change, coral bleaching, ocean acidification. So that's sort of the evil twin of climate change. When you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it does all the things, all the global warming type things. It also acidifies the ocean. So that carbon gets sucked into the ocean and makes the ocean more acidic, makes it harder for corals to live and shellfish to live and grow and so on. Also water pollution and associated things like coral disease. There are an awful lot of us. We all flush the toilets. Our waste has to go somewhere, and the question is where and how well cleaned up is it before it reaches the ocean and reaches the reef. And then at the bottom, acute local impacts. So this, as I said, I'm a fisherman, a diver, a boater. I have damaged corals in my life, and I'm just one of thousands of people that are out there doing this. Even those of us that are trying to be good stewards of the natural resources have an impact, whether it's accidentally or, heaven forbid, intentionally anchoring on coral reefs, running your boat into them, having your fishing gear become entangled in them. You know, we all have an impact, and there are lots of us having those impacts. So acute local impacts. So other marine protected areas, I mentioned the sanctuary, that's the blue outline here. We worked to establish that, lobbied Congress to establish it, passed the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary Act in 1990. That passed, it created those basic protections that I described. It, had a staff of people created, a budget created to go out and put in things like mooring buoys and to do research and to do law enforcement and to do all the things that an effectively managed marine protected area needs. The Sanctuary Protection Act also created a Sanctuary Advisory Council of local residents who are representing different interests: fishing, diving, boating, tourism, research, you name it. And I, and then previous to me, others, and now my colleague, our Marine Program Manager, serve on that advisory council. We give them advice whether they want it or not, and they usually do. We serve on their Water Quality Protection Program Steering Committee. We've worked with them on all sorts of initiatives over the years. And then the red box up here, this has new news. Did anybody know that you have a new aquatic preserve right offshore here as of about 3 weeks ago? The Governor DeSantis signed off on Senate bill and House companion bill, I can't remember the number, 1558 or whatever, doing all sorts of changes to the state aquatic preserve rule and the other rules associated with the Department of Environmental Protection. And part of that was turning what used to be called the Kristen Jacobs Coral Reef Ecosystem Conservation Area, this red area, into an actual state aquatic preserve. And that means it's now more like Biscayne Bay, which is an aquatic preserve, and various other aquatic preserves that are arrayed around the state. It's now going to be harder from a legal perspective to pollute it. They will get more, we hope, budget, more staff, more boats, more effort into conservation, restoration, education, law enforcement, and all the things that go into an effective marine protected area. We've also worked over the years with Biscayne National Park, Dry Tortugas, and all the state parks, aquatic preserves in this region, advising them. When they say, we're going to update our management plan, we say, you should look at the latest science, which we either have developed or we have obtained, and share it with them and say, think about managing this way. And sometimes they listen. So all those different boxes, the sanctuary, the parks, the now aquatic preserve, there's a risk that they get siloed. They only focus within their boundaries, but the water flows between those areas. The fish swim between those areas. The recreational and commercial users move between those areas freely. The Florida Reef Resilience Program is a Nature Conservancy, or I should say was a Nature Conservancy initiative designed to minimize that siloing, to get all of the natural resource managers to think about the South Florida marine ecosystem as one big interconnected system, and to focus on the challenge of climate impacts. What you see in the photo is coral bleaching. When corals get too hot, they bleach. Bleaching is the term. The coral animal expels the very colorful algae that live within its tissues, which provide the coral with nutrition. And if they don't recover, if it doesn't cool off, and if they don't recover quickly enough, they can perish. So looking at coral bleaching every year through our disturbance response monitoring program all across the coral reef ecosystem, from the Dry Tortugas west of Key West, all the way up through the Keys, all the way from right out here where we worked with Dr. Learman and his colleagues at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School. Different partners all throughout the reef ecosystem would deploy this monitoring approach so we could say this year bleaching occurred here but not here, and here but not here, and then to begin to look at why. Is it a matter of water quality? Is it a matter of the genetics of the corals? What is it? And is there something that we can do to make the reefs more resilient? We developed a coral bleaching response plan so that it doesn't catch everybody by surprise. We are forecast to have bad coral bleaching this summer because it's so hot. Last year was the worst year on record because it was so hot. So we started in 2005, and it was a fairly, at the time we thought, a bad year. This first line is 30 degrees. That's when bleaching starts to occur. Up around 32 is when death of the coral starts to occur. So these are two different sites, and these are the temperatures. So the temperature went above the bleaching threshold and then above the death threshold at one site. So we had this kind of bleaching. So mostly yellow, meaning sort of moderate. But then in 2014 in green and 2023 in the fuchsia color, we went well above the bleaching threshold in 23. We went above it both years, but it really, really was terrible last year. We lost, I don't have the number yet because the data takes a while to crunch, but we lost a vast number of corals last year due to coral bleaching. And you can see that represented in the dark red all throughout, basically from here all the way down through the Keys and Dry Tortugas. Over 90% of what remained, and that was already reduced from previous years. We get this data. What do you do about it? What do you do with that data? So we developed with the public agencies, that is the federal, the state, local governments when they were able, climate change action plan for Florida's coral reef. You know, what can the reef managers do? What do politicians and elected officials need to do? What can the scientists do? What can reef users, fishermen, divers, boaters do to be part of the solution instead of the problem? And that had a shelf life of 5 years, 2010 to 2015. The Resilience Action Plan was the successor to that. And in that time was the advent of two things: stony coral tissue loss disease, another terrible impact on corals that I'll get into in a second, and also the advent of really active coral reef restoration. So the big changes between these two plans were disease intervention, focusing on disease, and restoration, active restoration. So as of now, I said that the Florida Reef Resilience Program is sort of no more. It got merged in with the stony coral tissue loss disease response effort into, as of like 6 months ago, Florida's Coral Reef Resilience Program. And we coordinated this one, and Sea Grant, Florida Sea Grant, which is part of the University of Florida, coordinated this one, and we're kind of both co-coordinating right now. But it's really on behalf of the public agencies that are the official stewards of the natural resources. So stony coral tissue loss disease, you got bleaching over here, corals get pale. Cold water mortality, we had, it got, instead of too hot, it got too cold back at the beginning of 2010. That killed a bunch of coral. Bleaching has occurred. These are the orange boxes. Again, I said 2013. 2023 was the very bad one, and we're expecting another bad one. But then the purple. Purple is stony coral tissue loss disease. We still don't know precisely what the disease agent is, but we know that when it gets on a coral, generally it kills it. There are some interventions, antibiotic pastes that can slow it down, stop its spread, but it spreads basically like a skin lesion, if you will, from cell to cell to cell, and will kill and has killed countless corals. So what to do about it? The disease progressed from around here. It started near here. It went north and it went south, but it went south fairly slowly. So there was a big effort before the disease reached the Florida Keys and the Dry Tortugas to collect corals and to bring them into collections at aquaria and zoos and things like that. So lots of them in Florida, like Mote Marine Laboratory, for example, University of Miami, the Florida Aquarium in Tampa, St. Pete. But also, you know, there are aquariums all across this country, and they have the equipment, they have the expertise, they've got the people that know how to keep corals alive, And these corals have now been, basically it's a gene bank. So representative examples of all these coral species have been brought into these collections as a hedge against eventually figuring out what causes the disease and getting our hands around climate change so that we can begin to put corals back into Florida. This graph, the green is the sort of condition or the state of corals. The graph was made in 2011. You've got things like, local impacts, land-based sources of pollution, climate change are, degrading, pushing down on the condition of the reefs. And the thought here is if that just continues, you're going to get the red line outcome. By 2100, nothing left, essentially. If you just do threat abatement, work on the water pollution, work on overfishing, work on whatever the local threats are, you might level off at a sort of a low ebb. But the green line, the more optimistic line, is with the addition of active coral reef restoration. So growing corals, whether it's on land or in the ocean, placing them back out on the reefs and jump-starting, just like you would a forest after a forest fire, going in and planting trees, jump-starting recovery. This really follows a couple of different trajectories. This is how corals reproduce. One polyp, they bud. They don't necessarily have babies like we do always. They bud, so one will split into two, two splits into four, four splits into eight, and you get these massive structures as big as these tables. And then fragmentation, a healthy big coral that breaks into pieces. If those pieces, land in the right place, the fragments can restart. Just like you would take a clipping of this plant on your table, certain plants are able to reproduce like that. Vegetatively, it's called with plants, or through fragmentation with corals. And then there's sexual reproduction, the way that mammals reproduce, eggs, sperm, make a baby, start new corals. So all of these have their role in restoration. The big focus in the beginning was on fragmentation. Taking pieces of staghorn coral in this case and breaking them off, starting them onto these little pucks, and then growing them in these nurseries, and then taking the nursery grown stock out, planting it on the reefs. This was the early days. And then there were these innovations, floating tree nurseries. So instead of only being able to grow in one direction, the corals could grow in every direction, and all of a sudden you've magnified the amount of coral that you can grow. And then the point is not to grow them, the point is to get them out on the reef where they can then, one, become habitat for fish and invertebrates, but also begin to reproduce on their own. So if they get big enough, if they stay healthy long enough, they will reproduce sexually, send their progeny out into the wild, and become part of the solution. So this is the outplanting stage. These are my colleague Caitlin, wherever she is, that one, and her dynamic duo. We've got people here from Rosenstiel School, we've got people from Mote Marine Laboratory, and a variety of other institutions that came out and helped with this outplanting in the dry tortugas. And that's just the one way. So there's a lot of effort now as well on land-based propagation, so growing corals in tanks, taking those corals out and getting them, for a variety of different ways, getting them going in the ocean. That's still a fragmentation approach. The problem with fragmentation is you're creating genetic clones. You get exactly the same genetic material that you're spreading around, which is good, but it's even better if you can get sexual reproduction and get new genetic individuals that may pass on the best traits from their parents. So if one is resistant to disease and one is resistant to heat, you've got the best of both worlds. So groups like Secor International, some of this is happening here at University of Miami Rosenstiel School, are working on sexual reproductive approaches to coral reef restoration. So they gather the eggs and sperm, they create babies, and then they test them to see if they're more or less resistant to these various environmental factors. All of this is happening, but it was happening in a relatively uncoordinated way. The Nature Conservancy's latest effort, thanks to funding from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which has to be matched in order to get the grant, matched by our donors, is to do a comprehensive statewide strategy, or a reef-wide strategy, if you will. So all the way from dry tortugas up through here, up to St. Lucie Inlet, there's restoration effort happening. And in order to do that more efficiently, to be more successful, to get the resources that are needed to do it, to be able to talk about it more clearly. I won't read the whole slide here. We need to be more efficient. Instead of just everybody going out and trying it, we need to be coordinated, and that's what this effort is all about. It's got a tiered approach. We call Tier 1 is the statewide strategy based upon what we know about existing coral populations. How are the reefs doing? And what we know about how coral larvae, the free-floating, when they sexually reproduce, they spend a part of their life floating along in the water before they settle and attach to the bottom and become new coral colonies. What we know about where the reefs are, the healthier corals are, and how these larvae behave, we have a set of recommendations just about to come out in this Tier 1 strategy. If you're going to do this restoration, do it here and here and here to get the best bang for your buck. Once you've done that, you can get into Tier 2, and we're at a slight remove, but we're right on the heels with the Tier 2 plan for the new aquatic preserve, which starts right here off Key Biscayne and goes up to the north end of the reef ecosystem at St. Lucie Inlet. And that'll add in not just sort of ecological goals, but if you could restore, let's say that Tier 1 says there are 100 places you could restore and get more or less the same outcome, you still need to narrow it down because every one of these efforts is very, very expensive and challenging and fraught with challenge. So where are you really going to do it? So we add in what we call the ecosystem services. Which of these reefs are valuable for fishing? Which are valuable for dive tourism? Which are most valuable for protecting our coastline from the impacts of waves and flooding? So adding in the human perspective, and we start to get into where the state and others may invest their money to do the restoration. And then finally, and this isn't happening here yet, but it is already happening in the Florida Keys, you get into the very site-specific, okay, now we know where we're going to do it, we know why, where are we going to, how many of which species and where are we going to put them, and the really nitty-gritty detailed plan. So I've mentioned a few things along the way. The Marine Sanctuary, which starts right here and goes all the way down through the Dry Tortugas, is this close to updating its regulations. The proposal is to expand its boundary, to modify some of the existing small protected, more protected zones within it, change some of its regulations. That's been a 10-year process of public engagement and meetings and science, and they're about to release that and make it final. So that's next on my list. And then the new aquatic preserve is going to develop a management plan. So working with them to make sure that they have the best science, that they're making the best choices about how they steer their efforts is going to be a big focus. There are particular water quality challenges. You're probably familiar with the fact that right over here on Virginia Key, you have got a wastewater treatment plant, the central wastewater treatment plant. They treat the water to a certain standard, and it comes out of a pipe like this one and still has a lot of nutrients in it. Those nutrients, and perhaps whatever else might be in there, certainly the nutrients are not great for coral reefs. So there is a law in the books that says thou shalt not, after 2025, release your treated wastewater into the ocean except in an emergency. So we think that that's really important. That's going to be expensive, it's challenging, no doubt, but they need to meet that. And it's not just Miami-Dade. These wastewater outfalls go all the way up as far as Pompano, I believe. Some have made progress, others not so much. And then you've got, in places where centralized wastewater treatment is not as easy to do, you've got septic tanks everywhere. So getting septic tanks onto centralized sewer systems so that the septage, that is our waste, isn't getting into the ocean is really important. This is a project that I wasn't as involved in, but we partnered with the Miami-Dade Innovation Authority, which is, if you're not familiar with it, basically trying to encourage creative, lucrative businesses here in Miami-Dade County, to work with them to figure out a solution for what do you do with all the sargassum seaweed that washes up on your shoreline and all the other shorelines. So we worked with them to develop the RFP. A bunch of different applicants said, here's what we would do with it. And 4 of them, and I don't have them committed to memory, but 4 of them with 4 different strategies have been selected to get an award of funding from the Innovation Authority to now pilot their efforts. These are things like using the stuff for fertilizer, using the stuff for biofuel, using the stuff to create energy. So that is an example. And then the last one, which I don't have a picture of, is called Resilient Biscayne. And back to the point of, climate change impacts, flooding, erosion, hurricanes are happening. We've got vulnerable places like the Key, like downtown, like the Florida Big Pine Key where I live. If Hurricane Irma was any indication, we've got lots of vulnerable places and people. What are you going to do about it? Resilient Biscayne is a Nature Conservancy-led effort to do a scientific assessment of all the shorelines of the bay and say, for this stretch of shoreline, given its depth and wave environment and all of the other factors, this is the best kind of nature-based coastal protection solution. There are places or will be places where just a good old-fashioned seawall is the thing to do. But our goal is to say, what about in addition to that seawall, what if there was an artificial reef in front of it that would take the first bite out of the waves before it gets to the seawall? Could we improve habitat? Could we improve protection? Could we reduce risk to people and property? And so together we'll find a way. That's our motto. We need your help to do these things, and we really very much appreciate your time this afternoon. And I can take questions.
If we do all of that and put it back in the ocean, nothing in the ocean has changed. I mean, we're still getting hot water,
Right.
Garbage, sewer plant,
The way I look at it, we've got to reduce the threats. Climate change, water pollution, acute local impacts. We've got to reduce the threats, and we're still figuring out the restoration technology. We're still in the infancy of figuring that out. Like up in North Florida, if we want to restore a longleaf pine forest, I know how to do that. I can go to a nursery and buy 75,000 and plant them, and 70,000 are going to live, and da-da-da. We're really figuring it out. We need to develop the restoration technology and have the threat reduction and the restoration meet in the middle. But yes, there's no point in doing restoration if you don't reduce the threats.
Seafood, oysters, fish, other...
When that oil spill occurred, 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, we got really concerned that it was the oil itself or its constituents would reach us and hurt the reefs and hurt the fisheries. And I'm not saying some of it didn't find its way here, but it really stayed mostly confined as far as oil that you could see that was floating on the surface to the northern Gulf near where the spill occurred. They did all kinds of activities to contain it, and obviously got on the beaches and wetlands up there. The bigger sort of direct impacts were on the northern Gulf. If there have been any traceable impacts here, I don't know of them, and I certainly think I would have heard. Is it safe to eat the seafood? I eat the seafood. Yeah, up north.
Oysters and Apalachicola.
Yeah. We have a lot of oyster restoration work in that northern panhandle of Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana. It's a big thing for us. Some of it is focused on just oysters for their habitat value. We don't want people harvesting and eating them, but others are for aquaculture or for fisheries. And it really depends. It depends more on the watershed. What is there? Wastewater pollution and other bad stuff coming down from the land. I'm not as close to that body of work, but I am not hearing that the oil spill impacts are a current concern. They certainly were at the time, but I think that's worked its way through the system.
We do have field trips throughout the entire state, and so we do have one out to the Pensacola or Oyster Reef, and so if you have questions about our field trips, I'm happy to answer those questions.
Michelle, everybody. Michelle with the Nature Conservancy. We have one up here, and then I'll come to you, ma'am.
Regarding the Virginia Key water treatment plant,
Yep.
can you comment on two things? I believe they're building a pipeline out there, a new pipeline to take the effluent to somewhere else. I don't know where.
because it's leaking.
The latest that I understand is all the wastewater, all the flushes get gathered at the central treatment plant, and then there are others. There's one up in the North Bay near the North Campus of Florida International University, and there's one down by the big Mount Trashmore, North Central and South treatment plants. The wastewater gets gathered, gets treated to a secondary treatment standard. That means basically the pathogens are dead, but the nutrients are still there, and who knows what else is in there. And then it's going out those pipes. And my understanding is nothing after 2025, and I don't think they're going to meet this deadline, but that's why we need to be encouraging the county to do this. Nothing is supposed to go out those pipes except in an emergency, that is the hurricane or something breaks down or whatever. And instead, they're supposed to either reuse the water, that means clean it up more so that you can water a golf course or water a lawn or reuse it, or use deep well injection. So instead of a pipe going out into the ocean, a pipe going deep into the bowels of the earth where it should not come back up again. That's my understanding.
They've been successful with the deep.
That's what we have in the Florida Keys for the most part. And there's a running debate. There are deep wells and shallow wells. Nobody's ever been able to say for a deep well, which goes down more than 3,000 feet, nobody's ever been able to find where it comes back up again. I'm not saying it doesn't, but evidence is everything. There's no evidence of it. The shallow wells, which are like 100, 200 feet, comes right back to the surface, and it's got whatever it's got in it. Nutrients, pharmaceuticals, pathogens in some cases. So we've been pushing for the deep wells instead of the shallow wells in the Florida Keys.
Is that a lot about the porosity of?
It depends. So the porosity of the Keys is similar to the porosity here. It's limestone. It's like a Swiss cheese if you were to look at it, little holes everywhere. So if you inject wastewater, which is fresh water, into the ground where there's salty groundwater, the fresh water is lighter, it's more buoyant, it's going to come to the surface because salt water is denser and heavier. With the deep wells, it's going through what they call an impermeable layer. It shouldn't be able to come back to the surface in what they call the boulder zone, which is a geological layer way, way, way down there.
How the heck do they drill that deep?
Just like with oil wells or, one section at a time.
Because they talked about drilling wells here to help get rid of the excess water when we have floods. I mean, we flood here
Stormwater?
all the time, yeah.
Yeah, yep.
Share your concern about climate change and are actively working to that end, and the UES with them.
The Nature Conservancy is working with all 50 states. Not every state is as proactive as Florida. Some are more proactive than Florida. And that often changes with politics, I would say, generally speaking, our state now and our government now is proactive, but you may have heard recently they don't want to use the words climate change. They want to do the things that need to be done, but they don't want to talk about that dirty word. As long as they're doing the things that need to be done.
That everybody can do.
Yeah.
Nickel tax for everything, for the programs that are so expensive.
The comment was, why aren't we doing more? We could afford it. Yes, we're doing a lot, but the challenge is huge. We're not doing enough to meet the challenge at this time. The big we, government, nonprofit sector. Yes.
Dioxide to be rechanneled into underneath the North Sea. Are we involved with?
The Nature Conservancy has a Canada sort of affiliate. It's not called the Nature Conservancy. I think it's called Nature United. But it's, we coordinate, we have the same approach, et cetera, et cetera. I would not be surprised if they are tuned in to what's happening in the North Sea. And we have an Alaska program, certainly. I don't know enough about the global scale stuff to really give you a good answer.
The really global nasty politics.
There are politics at every level. I mean, we certainly go to the UN Climate Convention every time it occurs and advocate for the best possible policies. I mean, and there it's an interesting dichotomy between us big emitting countries like the USA and China and India and many of the developed world, and then small island developing states and very poor countries that are suffering a lot of the effects, and they're saying, help us out here. The politics are different at every level.
What
Yes.
is your policy for planting of trees? Are you involved in that?
I mentioned in the sustainability group, we've got a big focus on urban trees in the Orlando metro area. More work that I'm somewhat more involved and familiar with is restoring longleaf pine tree forests, not just the individual trees, but the whole forest, including the biodiverse wildflowers and grasses and ground cover and animals in North and Central Florida. We're pro-tree for sure.
Now, I have noticed over the last 25 years, I've traveled twice a year up to New York and back down here on 95. And I've been disturbed for 25 years because each year in my travel, more trees are cut down to widen highways, make more lanes. What do they do to replace the thousands upon thousands of trees that I personally have seen in my trips back and forth go down?
I can't give you a detailed answer. There are certain instances of particularly healthy natural areas where if it's a government or there's mitigation requirements. So if you cut down a bunch of trees to do a widening of a highway or whatever sort of project, you're required to then replant trees elsewhere. That's not always the case with every project or at every, the individual sort of small scale of a home, maybe not. It all depends upon the regulations. So I mentioned our focal areas for land acquisition, buying land, buying conservation easements, receiving the donations of land and conservation easements that can then be perpetually protected as natural area, natural habitat. Within those areas, North Florida, Central Florida, the Panther Corridor, we focus in particular on the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which is for over years, we've had various scientific guidance that says, buy this and don't worry about that. This is the latest version of it. It is taking into account the best information about the wide-ranging species like panthers, black bears, other large wide-ranging animals, but also the diversity of even the smaller species. So there are little wildflowers that only grow in one place. All that information gets rolled up and put into assessments of if we could protect these corridors, these pathways from north to south, from inland or coastal to inland, we would have the best long-term outcome for biodiversity and all the associated benefits that nature and biodiversity provide to people, like recreation, like water supply, and so on. So every year, Tallahassee legislative session, we advocate for funding for land acquisition, and lately, since the advent of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, that becomes advocating for funding to focus on the wildlife corridor. Is that what you had in mind?
Have, or should we have like a bed tax at our hotels?
The question was, should we have a bed tax at our hotels in order to pay for these things? So I don't know enough about, how funding happens in the Key or in the village. I can tell you what happens in Monroe County, where I live. We have a bed tax. It provides money for land acquisition. It provides money for bricks and mortar projects to make, this is all tourism related, to make the tourism product better. And for many years that just meant museums and hold fun events and things like that. But recently they've started to allocate it to coral reef restoration and other environmental conservation and restoration efforts. It's a vital part of Monroe County and the Florida Keys municipalities' funding for important projects, along with bond issues and all sorts of other mechanisms.
Their population.
So the panther was on the brink of extinction, like down to less than 50 animals, was very inbred, very, in bad shape. Habitat loss, hunting, all the things that were, contributing to the diminishment of its population were really at their peak up until like the 80s. I can't remember exactly when, 80s, maybe early 90s. And they decided, the wildlife managers decided, in order to save this animal, we're going to need to bring in some genes from Texas cougars. They brought in those Texas cougar genes that sort of revitalized the gene pool, so they didn't have all these inbreeding depression problems. Land acquisition, land management, preservation, protection, all the efforts have led to, we're somewhere, and I don't follow this day to day, but we're in the neighborhood of 200 cats now. So we're going in the right direction. And a big focus for us is, okay, every cat, every big male particularly, needs a huge home range, 50 square miles or whatever it is, very large. There's only so much land in South Florida where they are today. there's plenty of good habitat. There's plenty of deer to eat and wild hogs and raccoons and the things that panthers eat in Central Florida. There are big ranches up there that are full of these, not the cows, but the things that the things that the panthers like to eat, and the people, and we want them to eat. But there are no panthers there. How do we get them up there? So we're working on the corridor. We're trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together so they can go from where they are across the Caloosahatchee River up into the large existing natural areas like Fish Eating Creek Wildlife Management Area, Avon Park Bombing Range, our nature preserves in Central Florida, et cetera. But also there's a huge matrix of these ranch lands up there. So trying to keep the ranch lands from becoming the next subdivision is a big focus.
You know, the downer of it all.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the coastal state we are, how large we are, and the impact, the movement of residents now, you know, from western United States to now.
Yeah. The big question was, is it too late for coral and some of these other big initiatives? So if you look at it sort of objectively, the coral populations, despite the creation of protected areas, better regulations, better water quality improvement, the condition of coral populations is still in decline. So we haven't yet reduced the threats and developed the restoration technology enough to the level where we're going in the right direction in Florida. But what we learn here, where we've got the biggest population pressure, the biggest public, people using the resources. I mean, there's no place that I can think of in the world that has coral reefs this close to this many people with this many challenges. If we can figure it out here, or even if we fail to figure it out here, the things that we're learning by trying are helping the Bahamas, they're helping the Caribbean, they're helping Australia, they're helping Indonesia, and so forth and so on. So I'm afraid we're going to continue to decline, but even in decline, they're still the best. It's still the best diving in the United States outside of Hawaii or St. Croix or whatever. I still catch fish when I go. I mean, the ecosystem services, the things that people derive from these coral reefs, even though the coral populations are in the tank, are still very important. So it's still worth doing. If you take the 18-mile stretch, as they call it, down US 1 between Homestead, Florida City, and Key Largo, it's to your
Right?
east. No, it's to your left.
Oh,
It's to,
to the ocean side?
it's to the east, going down. If you take the other route, which is County Road 905, down towards Ocean Reef, north end of Key Largo, it's on your west, on your right. It's in that wedge.
Are there corals living in warmer waters, more equatorial perhaps, that can be brought here?
So 2 questions. Are corals already adapting to the increasingly, warm and other, affected environment? And 2, are there corals that live in hotter places that we might bring here and they would thrive here? So are they adapting? Evolution is occurring. Everyone that dies is one that's not making it through the filter of biological or natural selection. So the ones that survive, that are tolerating, water pollution, tolerating hotter temperatures, more acidic ocean conditions, they're the winners. They're so far. Now hopefully they'll be able to take what we're throwing at them 50 years from now. But those winners are the ones that are, like University of Miami, Milton Marine, and others are experimenting with, trying to figure out how much more carbon dioxide, temperature, et cetera, can they tolerate. So it's occurring. That's sort of at the big picture evolutionary level. But then there's what's called epigenetics. So even within a living animal, genes can express themselves differently. So and corals are complicated in that there's your basic coral animal, and then there are those algae that live within it, and then on the mucus that covers them, there are all these bacteria and other things. Sort of like we have bacteria in our guts that are beneficial, corals have that on the outside. So all these things are evolving and expressing their genes differently in response to the environmental changes. So it's happening. It's very hard, though, to predict where it's going or how successful they will be. And could we move corals up? There are people who are saying, bring them from the Pacific. The Pacific's doing comparatively good. Bring them on over. There are concerns about species becoming invasive, like things that, aren't in balance with our local populations and ecosystem. We're not there yet, but it's definitely on people's minds. It's definitely on people's minds. Point was, we often waste fresh water, so there are a couple of answers to that. There's the water resource itself, and then there's all the energy, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with getting that water, getting it to us, getting it clean enough to use, pumping it, moving it, and then you got to treat the wastewater. So the more water we use, the less water is in the Everglades ecosystem for the birds and the fish and you name it. And the more water we use, the more greenhouse gas pollution we create in order to use it and then clean it up. So yeah, use as little water as possible.
That sargassum this summer?
I have heard that there's a lot of it out there nearby, and it will all depend upon the wind directions and how the currents. We're fairly likely to see a bad wave. Yep.
July, August?
I forget exactly the seasonality if it would be any different here than the Keys, but yes, yeah. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for the invitation.